Awesome. Thanks, everyone, for joining me. Today is a talk about design. I'm a senior designer at Atlassian. Hey, wait. OK, that slide's a bit messed up. That actually says developer. OK, wait. Let me just quickly see if I can fix that. Devziner. Do you guys know what that is? I jokingly call myself that a lot, but you might not know what it means at all. Maybe this term is better. Hybrid. In my career, I've worked across all of the product lifecycle, from back-end and full-stack dev to front-end tools design, as well as actually like visual design, all the way to doing some PM things at some point in time. And this understanding between design and technology has helped me bridge the gap between the two domains. And hopefully I can convey some concepts from that domain from one to the other today. Today, I actually work in that cross-section of design on the design system. And I'll tell you more about the design things as we go along. But first, who remembers writing essays in school? We have a few hands up. Then you might remember that the essay has a standard form. First, you pose your case in the introduction, you add some supporting arguments, and then you end with the conclusion which states that you're right and everybody else is wrong. It's not really a Pulitzer Prize-winning setup, but it's a start. And similarly to this, apps actually have a bit of a setup, and design has a bit of a setup as well. There are some principles in design that can make a piece of work visually compelling that designers like myself use every day. And as designers and app developers, it's important to understand all of those elements and those principles to see how they work together. To not just make something that looks good, but to ultimately help solve problems that will allow your user to accomplish their tasks. And today, my goal is to give you a crash course on some of those principles. Oh, sorry. Messed up the slide. That was the app rules. So the principles. Specifically, I want to talk about how visual design pertains to content and function. And I'm going to do so with 5 principles. The principles are: the same thing should look the same things should go together, different things should look different, less choice is better, and introduce flair, but beware. Now, if you're thinking those don't sound like very official principles, then you're completely right, because I made them up. But they're my own little umbrella rules of actual real-life research and principles that I've collected together, and I roughly use these as a guide. And similar to this guide, the original standard essay form, we know that this is kind of nonsense in real life. A good writer will know when to break out of that form. And similarly, a good designer will know when to break out of principles. But the principles are shortcuts to solve complex problems that will help you create better designs. Some have exceptions, and some can definitely be broken, and some, in cases, might even be debunked. But like the Pareto principle, they will give you 80% of your goal with 20% of the effort. And if anybody was counting, that's the 6th principle. You get that one for free, but no more freebies. So they're a good point to start. My aim today is to hopefully raise the design literacy of the room a little bit and show you that design might not be as subjective as you might think. So next time when you're evaluating a piece of design work, rather than saying, oh, I don't like green, or that doesn't pop enough, you might be able to dig into some of the more minutiae and understand why they work that way and what would be good or bad. So to understand how design works, we first need to look at what design actually is. Now, to be honest, this is a flame war that's been going on for eons in the design community, and nobody can really define what design is. It's kind of similar to Vim versus Emacs or tabs versus spaces. Spaces, by the way, just so you know. It's actually easier to define what design isn't. So one thing that design isn't is that it's not just making things pretty. It's not just the veneer, the top layer of a thing. Designers generally agree upon the fact that it's not an afterthought, something that you can sprinkle on top of stuff. It's something that goes much deeper than that. One definition that floats around is that design is the intent of a product expressing itself through its successive layers, all the way until the outside. And one thing that rises with that is that a well-designed product is successful in reaching its goals, which means that it is sensitive to your user's needs. It's not just how it works, but the way that all the pieces are connected and the way that the layers are intrinsically linked, the way that everything works together. If it was just making things pretty or adding more and more features, then this hammer on the left would be pretty awesome because it's also a USB stick. But I would argue that it kind of fundamentally misses the point of being a hammer. So is that a good design? Probably the simpler yet more useful one on the right-hand side is the better hammer. The point is that good design is driven by needs. And this leads to another thing that design is not. Design is not magic. Because needs are visible and measurable. And so it's not as vague as subjective that you don't know that it's like in the air. It's a process. It has objective parts to it that you can measure, and it's repeatable. Another way to think about design, another definition, is that design is about communication. Your user is trying to get something done, so they say things to your app, and your app says things back. And that is a conversation that is happening back and forth. And fonts, layout, color, those things all have impact on how the message is conveyed, just like the way that my voice has an impact on the way that the message is conveyed. I'll try not to do that again, sorry. The point is that if you want proof for that, just imagine it going wrong. From a good communication form, we might end up having an angry argument over the phone. We might having an angry argument with our user between the app, rather than having a harmonious exchange, which is what you want, because harmonious exchange results in happy users, which is good for business. And speaking of business, let's get down to business with our first principle. The same things should look the same, or the law of similarity. Here we have a list of issues, but you wouldn't really be able to tell because you can't distinguish any of the content. We've got issue links in there, we've got some titles, and we've actually got metadata, but which is which? We can't tell. Now, we can start to solve this problem with concepts from Gestalt Theory. Gestalt Theory is a school of thinking in psychology that was introduced in 1910 to account for the observation that humans naturally perceive things as organized in patterns and objects rather than as separate parts. Now, this principle is known as prégnance. Many Gestalt principles exist, and I'll bring up a few today. And we use them in our day-to-day lives without even noticing, because it's basically the way that our eyes and the way that our brain works. And design often exploit the way that our eyes and brains work in using these principles in tandem to create a desired effect. So the first Gestalt principle is the principle of similarity. And it states that the human eye tends to perceive similar elements in a design as a complete picture, shape, or group, even if those elements are separated. So here we can see that the filled bubbles, they form a group separate of the outline bubbles. And that can be achieved with something like color, or shape, or even size. And here we highlight the fact that even though the two larger circles are apart, they still form a group somehow against the smaller circles. So how can we apply that principle to our list of issues? Well, there's quite a few ways, and I'll go through them one by one. First, we split everything up, making little islands, which I'll get into later with a different principle. But the most important thing is that we've styled our content differently. The metadata we've diminished a bit, made it gray, made it smaller. The main text is the darkest, it's black, it's in the middle. And then the links are blue, which is a universal thing across the web to have navigation links be blue. And this principle of having something be blue and having look like a link is known as affordance. Affordance is a term coined by James J. Gibson in 1966, which is the property or feature of an object that indicates which transactions can be possible between that object and an individual. In other words, it's if you see a thing, what you think you can do with it. That's the simplest way to think about it. And if you think about that, that's actually a really important feature in design, because our behavior really depends on how we perceive another party's affordances to be. It's how misconceptions arise, because if we either misinterpret an affordance, we use an object differently, or if that object misrepresents the affordance and it looks like it can be used in a certain way but can't, that is also a problem. So an example of this is this door handle. This is the door handle of a car. It seems almost intrinsically obvious that you would push the handle down and then pull it. But how many times have you stood in front of a door, pulling at it, pulling at the handle like crazy, only to notice after 10 seconds and your arm starting to hurt that there's a sticker that says push? That's a bad affordance. Similarly, in the digital world, interactive items often have an interactive state, a hover state. And so buttons change color when you hover over them, they change color when you click on them. They give that feedback. So links, for instance, are blue and underlined, and that's the way that the world has decided to show links, which is its affordance. If you, for instance, now give a hover state to something that isn't interactive, you might be misleading your users. So that's something to keep in mind. The benefits of using the law of similarity are basically that the user will start to recognize how different things work across your app, and they will start to recognize similar elements as they go through your app. Kind of intuitively, you're almost teaching the user how to use your app if you are consistent with applying these things. So the practical advice here is to ensure that links and navigation, paragraphs, and all of your interactive elements are all differentiated enough, but consistently styled amongst themselves. And now to our second principle. The same things should go together, or about grouping content. Let's continue with our list of issues, but let's add another column. Although we can see the different parts, we've got the links and the main text and the meta text, we can't really tell where one column begins and the other ends, or actually even it's kind of hard to scan through a column in itself. What are the relationships between these issues? We can't really tell. Another Gestalt principle is the principle of proximity. And the principle of proximity states that objects or shapes that are close to one another appear to form groups. And this clustering occurs because humans have the natural tendency to organize things that they see into groups. And this stays even if the objects become radically different. Our brain more easily associates objects that are close to each other better than it does objects that are far apart. And in this case, for instance, if we change the left-hand column to all being colored orange dots, like the ones on the right, they would still be perceived as two different groups because there's a spatial split in the middle. Another way to create groups is by using the principle of common region. The principle of common region states that elements tend to be perceived into groups if they are sharing an area with a clearly defined boundary. In layman's terms, if you want things to belong together, draw a box around it. A box around it is good. Borders. So let's start adding these principles to our columns of issues. First, we split them apart using proximity to give them all space. This helps a little, not really, but combined with a border, it all of a sudden becomes very strong. Now we have a list of cards, and we can identify each card specifically on its own. But we can continue by also adding a border to the columns. Adding a background strengthens the sense of the columns. And who here is starting to recognize a Jira board? So the other interesting thing here is coming back to affordance. Something that's very subtle in this is that the cards themselves have drop shadows, making them look like they float on top of the background. So that is a subtle affordance that the card is interactive, that you can pick it up. The background of the column itself is flat. So that doesn't have any of those affordance, indicating that it's not interactive. The benefits of using these types of principles is that they give structure to your data. They allow you to organize it visually and spatially. But that structure also strengthens the meaning of that content to your user and ultimately allows them to scan more. All of this improving the communication between the visuals and the content and your user. The practical advice here is to group related things together when you're designing a UI. And likewise, to keep unrelated things apart. Because you might be misleading your users if you place things that don't belong together inside of a box together. It's important to recognize that doing a trade-off like that, is something similar enough or is something different enough, is always a balancing act of optimization, and that is actually what design is all about. When is something similar enough, or when is something different enough? What if we did the same exercise, but instead of focusing on the things that are similar, we focused on how can we make them different and which things should be different? And that brings us to our third principle. Different things should look different, or creating visual hierarchy. Here we have a wall of text. It's cluttered, and there's too much shouting at you. Or rather, actually, there's nothing shouting at you because it's just all flat and the same thing. It doesn't guide your eye or tell you where you need to look first. All the same rules that we had before we can apply now, but there's a quote in there somewhere, and let's see if we can make that jump out at the user using the von Restorff effect. Hedwig von Restorff was a German psychiatrist in 1933. He coined this term, and this effect predicts that when multiple similar objects are present, the one that differs most from the rest is likely to be remembered. In other words, you remember the highlights and the lowlights and the thing that changed the most. You don't remember the rest. And this leads us to be able to create something like visual hierarchy, using all of the principles we have just now. The concept of guiding your user through a page or through content to lead them to that thing which they would want to see, which is most important to them. And we can do that through all the properties of design, so things like typeface, weight, sizing, space, color, alignment, or even intentional misalignment. Let's do that. We have our wall of text here. Let's add some spacing. So this is already splitting stuff out, splitting out headings, splitting out paragraphs. And now we're adding typography, using typeface, size, and weight to give presence to the most important things. And you'll see that we're giving the higher level headlines a bigger font size than the smaller level headlines. And then lastly, we can use some specific misalignment. By putting our quote in the middle, whereas everything else is left aligned, we're in a very simple way just pulling that out and making it pop out of the page. The benefits here are very much similar to our previous examples. It helps us give structure to the content, and that structure itself reinforces the meaning of the content, which allows for that content to be scanned more effectively, all improving the communication. The practical advice here is that you want to give adequate weight to the important elements on your page, and you want to use the attributes of the thing that you want to draw attention to design it in such a way that it differs from the rest. And now we come into more subjective territory. Here we need to mix our design acumen with a bit of business acumen and also really understanding our users' goals. Principle number 4, fewer options is better, or about minimizing choice. Imagine you have a select box, and you're building a form to ask users what favorite jam is, what their favorite jam is. Right now we've got four jams here. I don't know what cloudberry is, but it sounds delicious. But I know there's a lot of options missing because my favorite is apricot, but that's not on there. So let's extend this list. So now the list has become huge. So huge it's dropped off the page, and there's probably even more examples of jams that don't even fit in here. This has now become a bit hard to navigate. I can't find what I want, and ultimately I can't choose the thing that I actually want to fill in, and so I give up on the task. This type of friction is the same for things like really long navs or any navigation, any really long list that a user needs to choose something from. Sometimes more choices isn't always good. In 2000, psychologists did a study on jams, where on a regular day at the food market, people would find a display with a table of 24 different kinds of jams on sale. And then on another day, they would find in the same supermarket 6 different jams on that same table. On the day with 6 jams, a lot more jams were bought. People are far more likely to buy from choosing from a smaller set than they are from choosing from a larger set. This is known as Hicks' law. Hicks' law states that as the number of choices increase, the time to make a decision on that choice increases logarithmically. And this explains why the jams weren't bought when there were a lot of options, because people were standing in line to go through to the cashier. And if the choice was quick, they would just quickly grab an extra one. And otherwise, it took too long and it was too much effort. But this graph actually teaches us 2 things. One, if you have no choices, you are infinitely fast. And every choice, especially in the beginning, adds a significant amount of extra time and effort, up until a point where it doesn't matter anymore. So if you have a UI, a flow, for instance, where there is a lot of choices to be made and users aren't finishing it, and you think, well, that's because they can't do exactly the thing they want to do, it might actually be that there are too many choices there, and you might want to take a choice away. However, if you can't get around the option of taking a choice away, and you have to keep all those choices there, there's a few things that you can do to at least make it more manageable. One of those things is that you want to group the content into meaningful categories. So here, I've divided the content up into 2 slightly more manageable chunks: actual jams from berries and jams that are not really jams. And this list can now be a little bit longer because we have these groups that we can go to. But essentially, this is like deferring the choice, right? Because now, rather than 1 choice, we actually have 2. First, we look at the main heading, we find the heading that we want, and then we look at the options underneath the heading. So this as well, at some point, becomes unmanageable, and you might need to look at adding something like a search box. Even with that, sometimes it's really avoidable to get super long lists. And sometimes there are cases where it's okay to just actually show that list because it would be more cumbersome to have the search box, for instance. When that is the case, 2 things need to be fulfilled. First, the items need to be ordered alphabetically or numerically so that the user can scan them pretty quickly. And second, you have to ensure that the things that are on the list are things that the user recognizes almost intrinsically, things like names, countries, their postcode. It's only in that way that they can scan the list, immediately identify if it's the thing that they're looking for, and go up and down to find the one that they're looking for. This really only works for things like time zones, like I said, countries and phone numbers type of things. But at least that makes the navigation of such a long list possible. And this is why it's a bit more subjective, because we have different solutions for different use cases. So the benefits here really depend on what you're looking to get out of it. But one thing that you would want to optimize is that you want to optimize for task completion. You want users to go through your whole form. You want users to finish their task. And once you have that, you can start optimizing for speed. So the practical advice here, moving from a long list to a shorter one, is really to reduce complexity. But at some point you can't, and then you need to find other ways of managing that complexity. So a balancing act ensues. Now we come to principle number 5. Introduce flair, but beware. And here I'm going to talk about color. And color always seems to be one of the most subjective and mysterious parts of the design process. And I don't really know why. I think it's because color theory is sometimes a bit elusive. But there are very objective things that can be said about color, things that are very, very measurable. Let's have a look at some of those. Let's take our page of text that we had before. If we were going to start and add color to this, we might end up on two extremes. One, we could make it super flat and boring, or we could make it super loud and overwhelming. I kind of like this one, to be honest. But even if we did something more simple, like just gray out the author of that quote, for instance, because we think it is meta-information, slightly less important than the rest, we want to subdue it because we want the quote itself to be even stronger. We've actually introduced a problem, and we've introduced a problem for the visually impaired. If you think that designing for accessibility is a problem that you should look at later or something that is actually not that big of an issue for you, I'd ask you to think again. The United Nations in 2011 estimated that 1.3 billion people in the world have a disability. And that is roughly the same as the population of China and 4 times the population of the US. And here we look at what is actually the issue that they would find when looking at that little piece of text. People with low vision find it really hard to read text off of a colored background or text that has very little contrast to its background. They can't see the difference. The W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium that defines all the guidelines for how the web is built, they've introduced an accessibility guideline, which has standards AA and AAA, which tells us how much contrast we should have for different pieces of text. And they say that the minimal contrast should be 4.5 for normal reading text. And here we have a screenshot of what a link looks like, which is one of the reasons why links are bright blue, because that gives us a really good contrast of 8.5 to find navigation in a page full of text. Let's look at our example. So we'd made things gray, and in the bottom right, you can see that we now have a contrast of 1.3. Not that great. But simply by bumping up the gray a bit, we get to a contrast of 4.5, which gives us AA standard. We've made it readable again. Following accessibility guidelines is kind of a thing that will help you, that will force you to follow good practices. So not only will it give you accessibility, but it will actually often give you better UX in general. Things like good SEO results. Not only does it do that, but simply making it available and making it inclusive gives you a bigger audience, which ultimately leads to more sales and better use of your products. You can incur a usability issue if you really go too far with putting flair into stuff. So the practical advice here is to check all your designs with the contrast tool and consider sufficient contrast between text and the backgrounds. Accessibility is obviously like a huge topic, and I have not done it justice in this one little segment. So right after this talk, Roanna will be talking about accessibility in copy, and at the end of the day, Martin will actually be talking about designing for colorblind users. So if you're interested, check out those talks. Hopefully, I've demystified the process of design a bit, and I've given you objective handles to find out how it works. My goal was to raise the design literacy of the room just a little bit and show you that design is not as subjective as you might think, or at least there are very objective parts of it. So I now officially forbid you ever in a design review to say, I don't like it because it's green. It's not allowed anymore. You have to come up with something better. And hopefully now you have some principles by which you can actually evaluate a design. And just to reiterate, those principles were, the same things should look the same things should go together, different things should look different, less choice is better. And introduce flair, but beware. You may have noticed that during all of this, the principles that I shared with you, they often flowed from one into the other. Things like similarity, proximity, and contrast tend to overlap. And that is what design is. These principles work together, often creating a stronger effect. And we need to do those trade-offs for us. Do those trade-offs for our work. If you're designing stuff for Atlassian, we have something called the design system the Atlassian Design Guidelines, which you can find on www.atlassian.design. The design system embodies all of these design principles from the get-go. And if you were here earlier this morning, Hugh introduced a vendor sketch plugin, which will allow you to create designs using our component files. So if you're interested in that, check out the website. It's important to recognize that this was a crash course. These principles were essentially a collection of my own, so take them with a grain of salt. And they definitely won't be an immediate answer to all of the, I assume, very complicated issues and challenges that you guys face in the design of your products. They're not hard rules, and no design principle ever would be absolute. So it's up to you to make the trade-offs to balance your users' goals, your business goals, amongst all the other goals that you have in producing your product. And design is very much about resolving those differences, and it's up to you to make it work. It's through practice, user feedback, and iteration that we learn those kind of things. So, design away. Thank you.